Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that really shapes our daily lives here in Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena. We're talking about zoning.
It might sound a bit dry, maybe,
Yeah.
but honestly, its impact is massive. It affects whether, your kids can afford a place nearby, how our communities grow, or frankly, if they even can grow.
Exactly. And to help us unpack this, we're drawing from a really insightful webinar. It featured Nolan Gray. He's a former city planner, wrote a book called Arbitrary Lines, really digs into zoning history and issues.
And Greg Brooks from the Better Cities Project was also involved. He brings more of that on-the-ground local government perspective.
Right. So what we want to do in this deep dive is we'll understand how these rules, these zoning regulations, have kind of led us to the housing situation we see around us in Southeast Houston.
And maybe more importantly, identify some practical things, potential solutions that you, our listeners, could actually think about, maybe even push for locally.
Yeah, because if you're living in Deer Park, LaPorte, or Pasadena, chances are you're feeling this. You're seeing the housing costs, the availability issues. It's not just numbers on a page.
No, it hits home. It affects your daily life, your family's future, the whole vibe of the community.
Hmm.
So hopefully we can offer some clarity, maybe spark a few ideas for local action.
Okay, so let's start with that big picture. Nolan Gray really stresses this, the housing affordability problem. It's not just LA or New York anymore. It's everywhere. It's a national issue.
Mm-hmm. And he points a finger, a pretty strong one, at zoning as a major driver. Over the last 100 years or so, these rules have just gotten more and more complicated.
More restrictive, too.
Definitely more restrictive, to the point where it's often incredibly difficult and expensive to build anything other than, say, a standard single-family house on a pretty large lot.
So the kinds of housing we might actually need more of smaller homes, maybe duplexes, apartments, they're often just illegal to build.
In many, many places, yes. Think about those classic neighborhoods, maybe with a little corner store apartments above, often totally against the rules now. Parking minimums alone can kill those projects.
Wow. And it's not just the rules themselves, right? It's the process, getting approvals.
Oh, the process. It can be incredibly long, unpredictable.
Yeah.
That adds huge costs and risks for anyone trying to build.
You have to wonder how we got here. Was zoning always meant to be this complicated barrier?
Well, connecting to what Greg Brooks discussed, the history is, well, it's complicated. The initial idea might have been about basic organization, keeping factories away from homes.
Okay, that sounds reasonable.
But as Brooks highlighted, it pretty quickly got tangled up with less noble goals. In the early 20th century, it absolutely became a tool for segregation, for exclusion.
That's a heavy legacy. So it started with targeting specific groups?
It did. But over time, that exclusionary effect, even if not always intended that way now, has broadened. It ends up blocking out a much wider range of people, young families, essential workers, retirees, people who just need an affordable place in their own town.
So while zoning is a huge piece, is it the only piece?
Nolan Gray would say no, not the only piece, but a critical one. The crisis today impacts so many more people than it used to. It's not just low-income households. It's middle-income folks, too. Young people starting out, seniors wanting to downsize but stay local.
It really shows how housing connects to everything else in the community, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It impacts rural growth, how we revitalize our downtowns, managing development in established suburbs. It touches everything.
And it cuts across all demographics. When large chunks of the population can't afford to live somewhere, that really shakes the foundation of the community long term.
It threatens the stability, the diversity, the very health of the place.
Now, Nolan Gray brought up a crucial point. We can't just tweak zoning rules and call it a day, right? There's infrastructure involved.
Yes, that's vital. If you allow more housing, you have to think about roads, water, sewer, schools. How do you scale up public services to support that growth?
And how do you pay for it? That's the million-dollar question for local government.
Exactly. Doing it in a fiscally sustainable way is a huge challenge. You don't want growth to create more problems than it solves by straining services.
Greg Brooks also mentioned something about perception. When people hear growth, especially maybe in some parts of Deer Park or LaPorte that feel more suburban, they immediately picture
high-rises everywhere. Yeah, that's a common fear.
But that's not necessarily what smarter zoning means.
Not at all. Often it's about allowing more gentle density, maybe allowing duplexes where only single-family homes are currently allowed, or making it easier to add a small detached apartment and ADU in someone's backyard. It doesn't have to drastically change the look and feel.
It's about finding the right fit for our communities here in Southeast Houston. defining what responsible growth looks like locally.
Precisely. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay, so let's look at what others have done. California's experience seems relevant. They had such a gridlock that the state had to step in, right?
They did. The housing crisis got so severe, and some local governments were just unable or unwilling to act, so the state mandated certain changes.
But Nolan Gray also mentioned places like San Diego, where the city took the lead.
Right, and that's key. San Diego proactively reformed its own rules to allow more housing, aiming to increase affordability without wrecking neighborhood character. It shows local action can work.
Which is really important for us because cities here in Texas, including Deer Park, LaPorte, Pasadena, they already have a lot of power over their own zoning, don't they?
They absolutely do. There's significant existing authority. They don't need to wait for Austin to dictate solutions. They can lead on this.
The story of accessory dwelling units, ADUs, in California really illustrates that point, doesn't it?
It's a perfect example. Way back in 1982, the state basically suggested, hey, cities, legalizing these small backyard units is a good idea for housing.
Just a suggestion.
Pretty much encouragement. But what happened? For decades, many cities either ignored it or created rules so complicated, so restrictive, that almost no ADUs got built.
So the state eventually had to force the issue.
Exactly. The lack of local initiative led to statewide mandates, making it much easier to build them. It shows that relying purely on local goodwill doesn't always get the job done.
Okay, so this leads us to maybe some practical steps, some low-hanging fruit for reform right here. Let's start with those ADUs. What exactly are they?
Right. ADUs, accessory dwelling units. Think small apartments. Could be converting a garage, finishing a basement space, or building a small separate cottage in the backyard. Self-contained living units on existing properties.
And the appeal is what? Why are they seen as a good starting point?
Well, they offer benefits on both sides. For the homeowner, it's potential rental income, maybe helping with a mortgage or a place for family. For renters, it means more housing options, often in neighborhoods where apartments are scarce.
More affordable options, potentially?
Often, yes. And we've seen examples like Auburn, Maine, where they've been great for multi-generational living, keeping families close but with their own space.
And the experience elsewhere suggests it works without causing chaos.
Largely, yes. Nolan Gray points out that where ADU rules are reasonable and clear, homeowners often respond positively, and communities haven't seen major negative impacts. It's often quite popular once implemented.
Okay, what's another practical step? You mentioned parking earlier.
Ah, yes. Minimum parking requirements. These rules dictate how many off-street parking spots must be built with any new development, housing, or commercial.
Even if the residents or businesses don't necessarily need that many.
Exactly. It often forces the overbuilding of parking, which adds huge costs, uses up valuable land, and makes projects less feasible, especially smaller ones.
I can picture all the huge parking lots around strip malls in our area.
Right. Greg Bricks mentioned Lexington. Kentucky actually eliminated these requirements citywide. Think about the potential for those underused parking lots. Maybe redevelop parts of them with housing, shops, cafes, making better use of the land.
It ties into allowing more flexibility generally, right? Like converting empty office buildings.
Yes, Nolan Gray talked about that. Lots of vacant offices post-pandemic, but zoning often makes converting them to apartments incredibly difficult or impossible. We need rules that allow adapting existing buildings.
Okay, third area, minimum lot sizes. How do they fit in?
These rules set the smallest piece of land you can build a house on. When the minimum is very large, it basically mandates that only large, expensive houses on large lots can be built.
Which prices out a lot of people.
Absolutely. Working families, middle-class households, young people starting out, they get excluded. Plus, it has fiscal implications for the city.
How so?
Bigger lots mean development spreads out more. That increases the cost per household for infrastructure, more roads, longer water and sewer lines. It's less efficient financially for the city.
Nolan Gray suggested we need to kind of reset our idea of a starter home.
Yeah, it might not be the 3-bed, 2-bath on a quarter-acre anymore. Maybe it's a smaller single-family home on a smaller lot, or a townhouse, or a condo.
So allowing more variety.
Exactly. Creating what he called a ladder of homeownership. Different rungs for people at different stages of life and different income levels. It provides options.
And this all connects directly back to the economy here in Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena, right? Housing and jobs.
Inextricably linked. If the people who work here in our schools, hospitals, local businesses, the plants can't afford to live here, that's a huge problem for employers and the entire local economy.
Especially for those essential workers, the median wage folks who keep things running.
Critical sectors like healthcare, education, manufacturing, they rely on these workers. If housing costs force them into long commutes or make them leave altogether, businesses suffer, services suffer.
That story about Auburn, Maine was interesting. They changed housing policies and businesses felt more confident moving there.
Because they knew their workforce could actually find housing nearby. It became an economic development tool.
That sounds like a conversation worth having with local employers here. What are their challenges with workforce housing?
Definitely. Understanding that perspective can really highlight the urgency. Plus, having a reasonable cost of living, driven partly by housing, can be a major competitive advantage for our region in attracting investment.
The flip side is high housing costs strain public services too, right? Harder to hire teachers, bus drivers.
Big time. And you end up with these weird, unsustainable fixes, like building special teacher-only housing projects, which we've seen in really expensive places. That's just a Band-Aid, not a real solution.
So focusing back on ADUs for a moment, if a community like ours decides to embrace them, what makes for a good ordinance versus a bad one?
Okay, good ADU ordinances thinking about the substance tend to be simple. They avoid tons of extra restrictions beyond the basics. Safety codes, reasonable setbacks, maybe size limits that fit the context.
So not overly complicated.
Right. And the rules need to be feasible for the typical types of properties we have here. Things to avoid are overly burdensome rules like requiring the owner to live on site that often kills financing options or mandating low rents without providing any subsidies. That just means few get built.
And what about the process of getting one approved?
Process matters hugely. Good ordinances have clear, easy-to-understand permitting. Predictable timelines are key. The agencies need to be customer-focused, remembering they're dealing with homeowners, not giant developers usually.
You mentioned San Jose having same-day permits.
For compliant applications, yes. That's the gold standard. Compare that to months of waiting and uncertainty. Homeowners need a clear yes or no based on clear rules, not a long, drawn-out "we'll see" that depends on discretionary decisions.
And improving that permitting process, that helps beyond just ADUs.
Oh, absolutely. Streamlining permitting, setting reliable timelines, fostering that customer service culture in planning departments, that's low-hanging fruit that benefits all kinds of development trying to follow the rules.
That idea of letting licensed architects or engineers sign off on plans sounds interesting too.
It can be a way to leverage existing professional standards to speed up reviews, freeing up city staff for more complex projects without sacrificing safety.
So let's paint a picture. If Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena manage to get their local zoning right, what are the upsides?
The big upsides. Young people might actually be able to afford to stay or come back. Our local governments get to guide growth proactively in a way that works for current residents and is financially sustainable.
And the community becomes more attractive overall.
More attractive for diverse investment, yeah. You avoid the path that leads to the problems we see elsewhere. Young people leaving, businesses struggling to hire, rising homelessness.
So doing nothing isn't really a neutral option.
Not at all. Inaction basically means choosing to eventually face the same affordability and workforce crises seen in places like California.
Okay, but what about the pushback? The whole preserving community character argument, that comes up a lot.
It does, and it's a sensitive point. Sometimes, let's be honest, that phrase can be used to mask opposition to any change or any new neighbors who might be different.
But the desire itself isn't necessarily bad. People like their neighborhoods.
Of course not. But it's important to understand that a lot of the needed housing growth can happen gently. Duplexes, ADUs, small apartment buildings on corner lots. These don't have to drastically change the feel of a place.
So it's not necessarily McMansions versus skyscrapers.
Right. The real choice is often, as Nolan Gray puts it, do you want a community that looks almost exactly the same but becomes unaffordable and exclusive? Or a community that allows some subtle physical changes but retains its vitality and allows people to stay?
Those older mixed-use buildings, shops below, apartments above, they often fit right into existing neighborhoods.
Exactly. That's a traditional pattern that works. It's not radical.
What about finding the right balance between clear rules and flexibility? Too strict isn't always good either.
No, if the rules are too rigid and don't allow for common sense adjustments, you end up forcing everything into a discretionary review process. That means special permits, variances.
Which can be slow, expensive, and maybe unfair.
Potentially, yes. It can favor developers with more resources or connections. The goal should be clear, consistent rules that allow good projects to proceed as of right, meaning if you meet the code, you get your permit predictably.
But the rules still need to actually allow needed development.
Correct. Clear rules that say no to everything aren't helpful either.
One thing that's really striking is how current zoning often makes it illegal to rebuild what's already there in some of our older, maybe more central neighborhoods.
It's bizarre, isn't it? You have charming neighborhoods with smaller homes on smaller lots, maybe some duplexes or fourplexes, that people love. But the current zoning would forbid rebuilding them if they burn down. They're non-conforming.
What problems does that cause?
It makes it hard for homeowners to get loans for renovations, complicates insurance. It basically discourages reinvestment in these existing neighborhoods. A good first step is often just legalizing what's already built and working well.
And think about vacant buildings on main streets. Zoning might be preventing them from being reused effectively.
Definitely. Old parking rules use restrictions.
Oh.
They can make it impossible to bring life back to a vacant storefront with, say, apartments upstairs or a mix of uses.
So taking a look at our local code here in Deer Park, LaPorte, or Pasadena could reveal some of these barriers.
Absolutely. And talking to local business associations, they often feel these frustrations directly when trying to improve commercial areas. They can be key allies in reform.
Okay, let's circle back to ADUs one last time. There seems to be a lot of hope pinned on them. Are they really that impactful?
They are surprisingly impactful in some places. California data shows ADUs making up a significant chunk of new housing units in cities like LA, maybe 1 in 3 new homes in some periods.
Wow, 1 in 3. That's substantial.
It is. Now, ADUs alone won't solve a massive housing shortage, but they are a really valuable incremental step. They add supply, provide options.
And maybe build confidence for bigger changes.
Exactly. That's why Nolan Gray calls them that gateway drug to housing reform. Communities try ADUs, see they don't ruin the neighborhood, see the benefits, and it makes the conversation about other reforms, like allowing duplexes or townhouses, seem less scary, less abstract.
It's like the camel's nose under the tent, in a good way.
Sort of, yeah. It relieves some pressure and shows what's possible.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, the key takeaway seems to be that zoning rules have a really profound effect on our communities. Deer Park, LaPorte, Pasadena, included especially around housing costs.
And critically, there are actionable things our local governments can do. It's not hopeless.
Starting with that low-hanging fruit, ADUs, taking a hard look at parking requirements, rethinking minimum lot sizes.
Those are concrete starting points. And underlying it all is the need to really understand our local situation, talk to residents and businesses, and build a shared idea of what positive growth looks like here.
Because taking action locally means we can shape our future, keep our communities affordable and vibrant, and avoid the pitfalls seen elsewhere.
It's about being proactive to create sustainable, inclusive communities for everyone, now and in the future.
So as you think about this, here's a final thought. Pick one zoning rule in Deer Park, LaPorte, or Pasadena, maybe parking, maybe lot size, maybe something else you heard today. What's the very first step you could take just to learn a bit more about how it works here and what its real impact is?
This has been The Deep Dive. We're focused on empowering you, the residents of Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena, Texas, to improve your lives and community with actionable information for local impact. If you find value in what we do, please consider supporting us at thinkandactlocally.com/donate. That link is also in the show notes.